This is the Gospel according to Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
You may be seated. Our Gospel lesson today is another example of Mark's skill in writing. He has sandwiched a story. Again, he has one story that he begins, he stops the story, starts another story, finishes that story, and then begins another story. And that's kind of the way Mark works. He sandwiches stories like this. But there's always a reason why, because these stories connect. And there are always a connection points in these stories. They're two stories that actually connect in many different ways. As the story begins, this is the finish of the story from last week. He had gotten into the boat and started traveling across the lake, and the storm and all that stuff happened. Well, they finished the journey, and they got to the other side of the lake. He gets out of the boat, he steps onto the shore, and he's immediately surrounded by a crowd. They come up and he's immediately surrounded again by a crowd. This is not uncommon. We see this over and over again. When as soon as he steps out of the boat or steps into the village or steps into an area where people can see him, they crowd around. And so he's got this crowd that have come to listen, and some have come to be healed, some have come to listen and learn, and some have come to be healed. And so he's doing that. And in the midst of this, one of the synagogue leaders. Now we need to. This is a Jewish man. He's a leader in the synagogue. He would be like one of the elders, or not an elder, but he'd be like, like the church council or the members of the church council. He's on the board of trustees. He's a leader in the church, and he's come to Jesus and he bows down to him and gets down on his knees and he begs him over and over again, "Please come and heal my daughter. She's dying. I'm worried about my daughter. She's dying." Jesus said, "Okay, I'll come." And he started heading off. But as he starts heading off, again, the crowd crowds around him even tighter. And in the midst of the crowd, here's where the story is interrupted. There's a woman who has been having a hemorrhaging disease or a problem for 12 years. Now I can imagine, now think about this, she's had this problem for 12 years. That would put her age-wise somewhere around 28 to 30, somewhere in there. If she's had a disease for 14 years. It doesn't say she was married. Doesn't say she's a widow. Doesn't say she was divorced. Doesn't say anything about her other than she's a woman who's had a disease or a problem for 12 years. If she has come into a marriageable age around 14, which is common in that culture, if she's had this disease for 12 years, she's somewhere 26, 28, 30 years old, somewhere in there. Which means then that her entire life, her entire adult life, has been consumed by this problem. It means she's probably never gotten married, because if this disease or this problem developed when she was 12 to 16 or 14 to 16 years old, somewhere in there, which is the marriageable age in this time in history, then she probably never got married because of this problem that she had. Which means she had no value to society whatsoever. Because she's not married, she cannot produce any heirs or any children, she cannot produce a Messiah, she cannot do her Jewish duty as a woman in the Jewish society. She is outcast because of her disease. She lives on the margins of society. She can't go into town and just go down to the, to the market and do the things she normally, normal people would do. She can't do any of those things because she is ceremonially, religiously, and in every way, societally, she is unclean because she has this blood problem, this bleeding problem. In her mind, though, she's thinking, if I can touch his robe, if I can just touch a piece of his garment, that faith that she has is, this will heal me. This will cure my problem. Crowds around, crowding around. And I can imagine there's dozens of people touching Jesus. I can imagine this. They're not touching him on purpose. They're touching him because they have no choice. It's just the crowd is around him. And this woman sneaks through this crowd. She reaches through the crowd and touches his robe. She immediately feels that she's healed. Immediately she feels that everything in her body is now right, the way it's supposed to be. It's, again, her faith is what Jesus felt. There's all these people crowding around, touching him. None of them are getting healed. They're crowding around, they're bumping up against him, and they're not getting healed because that's not what they want. That's not what their need is. That's her need. Her need is to be healed. And so she has the faith to be healed. All the rest of them are there to learn and listen and just to be part of the group. She's there for the purpose of being healed. And when she touches him, Jesus feels that power. He walks around. I can imagine this in my head. I'm thinking, Jesus walks around with this great power inside of himself, given by God. That he produces this energy that flows from him. We've met people like that or similar to that. Very charismatic people. People with a lot of energy, a lot of power inside of themselves. They produce a great aura. For those of you who can see auras or know about these kind of people, they produce great auras. Their energy is stretched out way beyond their a normal person's body. I can imagine this is like Jesus. He's this charismatic leader. He's got this power of God inside of him that if you have the faith to touch him, if you have the faith to have a close encounter with Jesus, you're healed. Body, mind, spirit, you're healed. And that's what she does. Jesus feels this energy, this loving, powerful energy of healing leaves him, or a piece of it he feels departs him. He touches this woman. He feels this. And he says, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" And of course the disciples, the apostles that are gathered around there, the rest of the crowd are going, "Everybody's touching you." What do you mean somebody touched me? Everybody's touching you. And Jesus And I know in his mind he's got to say, yeah, but this one was special. This one was different. This was not the normal touch. This was a touch of power. This was a touch of faith, a touch of love, a touch of caring, a touch of meaning. And so trembling, realizing that she's going to get caught out, or maybe just out of the honesty of her life, she turns around and comes back to Jesus trembling and says, it was me. I touched you. He tells her faith has made her well, and that's true. It's her faith that led her to touch Jesus. It's the power that Jesus carries that healed her. Your faith has made you well. You're healed. And just as he's telling this, at the same time he's speaking these words of healing to her, these words of comfort to this woman, Jairus hears from people that have come from his house that your daughter's dead. Why bother him anymore? He's not going to be able to do anything about this. Jesus, overhearing this, either through his... we hear Jesus hears what goes on around him a lot more frequently than his disciples and the apostles really recognize. Because every once in a while you see this in Scripture, says Jesus overheard this. Jesus heard them saying this. Or Jesus knew that they were saying this. And so he confronts them. He says, just have faith. Jairus, just have faith. You came to me in faith. Hold on to that belief. And we'll go fix this. So they head off toward Jairus' house. They get there, and as Jesus arrives to the place, of course, everybody knows or everybody believes that this child has died, and so they're all mourning and wailing and doing what they're supposed to do at the death. All of the villagers that are around there are mourning, wailing, moaning, and they arrive, and Jesus asks them, why are you... She's not dead, she's only asleep. Now Jesus hadn't even looked at this little girl yet, but he knows that she's just asleep. Jesus could be using the euphemism of she's sleeping as saying she's actually dead, but that's not what he presents. He presents the fact that he believes she's still alive. And so he steps in, he throws everybody out because of their unbelief, surrounds himself with people who do believe, which is the mother, the father, and 3 of his apostles, Peter, James, and John. And Jesus says, Talitha kum. When he says this, of course, this reminds me of several other stories. We have the Elisha story, or the Elijah story, the first one. This is the first healing, bringing back to life story. Is Elijah bringing a little boy back to life, the widow's son. And then Elisha does the same thing, and that was in 1 Kings. In 2 Kings, Elisha does the same thing. He heals a woman's child from death. And we have Jesus doing the same exact thing, raising a child from death. Then there's a story in Acts chapter 9 where Peter raises a child, or raises a woman from death. And her name is Tabitha. This child is known as Talitha. Very similar. There's a similarity there. Tabitha means gazelle. Talitha means little girl. There's a little difference in the words, but when Peter says it, he says, Tabitha, whom? Tabitha, get up. Which is remarkably close to what Jesus says here. Talitha, little girl, get up. The little girl wakes up. She sits up. Everybody's kind of amazed at this. And he tells them to get her something to eat. There's compassion again. She's been sick, dying. She's now alive. She's probably hungry. Jesus says, feed her. And this is also proof that she's alive, because dead don't eat. The living eat. Remember when Jesus, after Jesus' resurrection, and he meets the disciples on the beach, and he walks up to them, or they come up to him, and he's already cooking fish on a little grill. And he says, let's eat. And he eats with them. There's the upper room, when Jesus returns right after Mary Magdalene and them all come, and then Jesus comes, and that's the day Timothy isn't there. Remember that story? When he gets up into the upper room, what does he do? Let's eat. He eats. Proof that he's alive. And so he says, give the girl something to eat. Faith is a powerful thing. Faith is a powerful tool. Faith is a powerful way of living your life. Believing, having faith, understanding that God is with us in all things. The story of Jairus kind of tells us that God doesn't always act in the way we expect. Sometimes God acts in different ways than what we expect. But God's healing is there. Another little note on this is that the woman had this hemorrhaging problem for 12 years. Talitha, the little girl, was 12 years old. See the connection? As long as this child had been alive, this woman had had this problem. And Jesus fixed both of them. This 12-year-old's problem and a 12-year-old problem. He fixed them both. And again, here's one of the connectings in the story that makes it a storyline that we understand is he did this on purpose for us to understand about this. Faith. Faith in Jesus. Our faith that Jesus is our Savior that leads us into a new life. By following his teaching, by understanding his love and caring for us. Us showing that love and care for others. That is the faith that we hold on to. That is the faith that leads us into the kingdom. And I think that's what these stories are both about. About believing, about having faith. Not just faith in our salvation, but also faith in our kingdom. Faith that God will watch over us and help us. And find us ways to become healthy again when we are ill. Today is the beginning of PTSD recognition week, or a week of recognizing that PTSD exists. And it is through faith, it is through belief, it is through understanding, it is through the hope of God's love for me that I live in the belief and understanding that God heals. No matter how difficult or how challenging things are for you, God heals. Body, mind, and the spirit. So this week, in more personal prayers, pray for those that you know and those that you don't know that have suffered through this, or that suffer with it still.